And good to see so many people still here. I'm Christensen, as Andy just introduced. This paper was co-written with Kasper, my PhD student, who is online. Hi, Kasper. And Paul from VIA University College in Denmark, and Linden in the back somewhere. He's there. And we're basically looking into this issue of the link between design and entrepreneurship. That's the topic for this talk, and I'll take you through it now. So, over the past few decades, the meaning of the term design has slowly shifted from pertaining mainly to the practice of a certain type of profession, which was merely the pursuit of formerly trained architects, engineers, and designers, to now also denoting a special kind of thinking, design thinking, which people from any profession can engage in. In many cases, or many respects, this shift is also the topic of the conference, of course, that the frontiers of design are expanding. Is this a blessing or a curse? And we thought in this paper we would dive into this issue, looking into the overlap between design and other fields, in this case, entrepreneurship. The former speaker just reminded us that organizations are also designed, so there is already sort of a overlap there between entrepreneurial venturing and design competences. And this is, in a sense, what we explore here. So we wanted to investigate the nature and effects of this shift, and we present here an empirical study contrasting design students with business students, both in terms of how they are trained to think, as well as in terms of how their different formal professional training leads to their self-efficacy beliefs and entrepreneurial intentions to start a business. And before I go on, I should say I will be saying self-efficacy many times. I'm Danish. In Danish, we usually call it self-efficacy, so I'll probably mispronounce it many times. I'm sorry for that. But it's self-efficacy, that's the correct term, even though I may say it another way during the talk, sorry. So, self-efficacy beliefs are beliefs in what you believe you can do, and we are looking into here basically what do design students believe that they can do upon graduating, in special respect to entrepreneurial venturing, that is entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs and their entrepreneurial intentions. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because design students much more often than other types of students end up starting their own business. That's at least a strong case in Denmark, where I come from. In a Danish context, approximately 30% of all design students exiting and graduating from a design school end up starting their own business in the first 10 years after graduation. That number far exceeds other types of professional graduates. The numbers for the higher education average is 7%, with design students being 30%. Business students, you would think, shouldn't they also be starting businesses? 11%. So design students far exceed the business students in terms of starting their own business. So how come? What is the explanation for this? There can be many explanations. You might think that this could pertain to the job market, to the labor market, for designers inviting for small-scale startups. That's one explanation. You can also say, well, what we see sometimes is that the unemployment rate in the short term for designers is fairly high. So it could be necessity is the mother of business venturing. Could also be an explanation. Those explanations are not what I'm pursuing today. It's actually a third type of explanation we're trying to look into here, which is perhaps designers feel they have the competences needed to start a company, and thus that leads to their higher degrees of self-efficacy beliefs in entrepreneurship, meaning that they start a company based on these entrepreneurial intentions. So that's the context here. Okay. In the paper you'll see a long theory sections. I can't take you through the whole thing, but I will take you through the 4 hypotheses we developed for this study. So the first one is basically saying that entrepreneurial self-efficacy, ESE, has some sub-factors that has been recorded in the literature already. We looked specifically at 2 of them, new product development and opportunity identification and commercialization, as 2 factors feeding into whether students believe that they can start a company. And both of these should possibly predict entrepreneurial intention. This first hypothesis has been documented already in the entrepreneurship literature for entrepreneurship and business students, and we wanted to extend that now to a design context, testing whether that's also the case for design students. So the first hypothesis follows on from past findings, you could say. It's a replication study in a design context, this first hypothesis. The second hypothesis then moved beyond this and say, well, why is it, or what is leading into these types of entrepreneurial self-efficacy? And one thing that can be thought to be important here is ways of thinking. Design thinking is, of course, a major topic for this conference. And design thinking has also entered the business context. And it has been argued that for entrepreneurial venturing, thinking like a designer or thinking adaptively is quite important. So for hypothesis 2, we hypothesized that for both business and design students, adaptive cognition positively predicts entrepreneurial self-efficacy in terms of both new product development and opportunity identification and commercialization. So we're basically saying here, we don't expect a difference between design students and business students in terms of their level of adaptive cognition, because in design, it has been argued that adaptive cognition is important. We have co-evolution of problem solution. We have problem reframing. We have uncertain task environments. We have a high level of uncertainty. All of this requires adaptive cognition. This has been argued in the design literature. Similar things have been argued in business and entrepreneurship literature. Basically, it has been argued there that the business entrepreneur operates in an environment that is characterized by being very dynamic and very uncertain. And both of these terms require a high level of flexibility of thinking that is also to be reflected in adaptive cognition. So to measure adaptive cognition, we used a standardized scale that was developed in the entrepreneurship literature, measure of adaptive cognition by Haney and Shepard. Okay, so that was the first two hypotheses, saying basically that design students and business students share a kind of thinking that should lead into what they believe they can do. The third hypothesis then splits them apart and say, well, the way they think is not the only thing that characterizes the difference between business students and design students. Actually, they have taken part in a formalized education. That education teaches them how to think, but it also teaches a variety of other things. They're taught to sort of engage in specific functions in organizations. They are taught to carry out specific capabilities. They are taught in different ways. So in design, it's typically studio-based learning, whereas in business, it's typically case-based learning, and so on and so forth. There are many different distinctions here to be made between the types of educations that they engage in, and those details of their education should lead to differences in entrepreneurial self-efficacy, we thought. And specifically, the hypothesis here is that design students with the heavy emphasis on product development, material interaction, and the like should lead to the students having a higher degree of self-efficacy beliefs within new product development, whereas the design student, or business student, should have a high degree of their ability to engage in opportunity identification of new business opportunities and commercializing products that have been developed. This is part of their training. This is part of the pedagogy in business education. So here, for hypothesis 3, we separate and say there's a distinction to be made. So for hypothesis 4, we move beyond the starting of a company and look instead at, is there also a distinction to be made in terms of who believe they are able to acquire and scale a company? So entrepreneurial intention can both pertain to starting a company, and it can also pertain to just wanting to acquire and scale an existing company where you did not necessarily have anything to do with developing the product being sold. That is also entrepreneurial intention. And so for hypothesis 4, we're basically saying, well, that should be something that business students are more interested in and believe they can do. relative to design students. And that should be mediated by that second kind of entrepreneurial self-efficacy pertaining to business opportunity identification and commercialization. Okay, so that's the setup. What did we do to measure this? We did a survey. We surveyed 296 students from a large design and business university college in Denmark. So it's a university college that basically has people enrolled in a common program. They start up the first semester in the same program, then they split into their specializations in either business or design. So the design students go into, for example, fashion design or furniture design. The business student go in, for example, brand management or retail. And that is the distinction we're using here. Which specialization do they opt into? And how does that then affect their entrepreneurial intentions and entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs? We measured entrepreneurial intention using this measure by Xiao, a standardized measure used in past research. We, of course, tracked their level of that specialty education, whether they were design specialty-focused students or business-focused students. And we've then tried to measure their entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs within new product development and opportunity identification and commercialization. And we measured their level of adaptive cognition also using this standardized measure. We added some controls: age, gender, do they have children, is there an entrepreneur in the family? All of these things have been found to influence entrepreneurial intention in past research, so we added that as controls. And we carried out then structural equation modeling to test for the findings. This is some of the descriptive results, just so you can see how they interconnect these measures. On the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more meaningful result, which is the actual testing of the hypothesis. The bottom part here is just showing you that the two models we're basically testing had good model fits. So the model we were using and testing fit the data quite well. So this is then the results section. Did we find support for these hypotheses? We did, in many respects at least. So for the first hypothesis, is there a relation between believing you're capable of engaging in entrepreneurial activities, and does that then predict whether you have the intention to actually start a business? Yes, for both of these types of entrepreneurial self-efficacy, both new product development and opportunity identification and commercialization, positively feed into entrepreneurial intentions. That's support for hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2 was the testing of whether adaptive cognition actually positively predict these two types of self-efficacy. We predicted both would positively feed into these self-efficacy beliefs, and in both cases they do. So support for hypothesis 2 also. So hypothesis 3 was the one where the two types of education diverge, and we were anticipating that design students should have a higher degree of entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs within new product development relative to business students, and the other way around for business students relative to design students for the other type of entrepreneurial self-efficacy. Here, education is coded as design students being 1 and business students being 0, so a positive relation here means that it leans towards the design students. So this is again in support of the hypothesis. If you're a design student, you believe you have more capabilities within new product development, which is a subfactor of entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs. And conversely, if you're a business student, you believe you have more capabilities within opportunity identification and commercialization, and thus that you're capable actually engaging in company startups in this respect. So, in all respects here for hypothesis 1, 2, and 3, in support of the hypothesis. For hypothesis 4, this is not in the slide, but I can just briefly tell you what it showed. There we had the entrepreneurial intentions pertaining not to start a business, but to acquire and scale another business. developed by someone else. And here we did find that the business students had more intentions for that. We had hypothesized that that relation should be mediated through opportunity identification and commercialization. That was not the case. The mediation was not the case, but the relation was there. The business students did have high intentions to acquire and scale. So only partial support for hypothesis 4. Okay. So how can we conclude on this study then? Well, we can conclude that entrepreneurial self-efficacy do predict entrepreneurial intentions to start a new business in both business and design student samples. We can also conclude that the level of student adaptive cognition predicts entrepreneurial self-efficacy in both business and student samples. And then we can conclude that formal specialized training in design versus business lead to differential effects on two important entrepreneurial self-efficacy subfactors. That is, the design students believe they're more capable of achieving this new product development, whereas the business students believe they are more capable of achieving business opportunity identification and commercialization. And formal business training, finally, relative to design training, leads to entrepreneurial intentions to acquire and scale an existing company. Now, this has some implications. Design and business students display adaptive cognition fairly equally in this study. Yeah, thank you. That's perfect. And with the same kind of effects on students' entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs. That is, design thinking actually positively predict designers' self-efficacy beliefs and their behavioral intentions to in areas that go beyond design tasks. So what we're showing here is that design students, when trained in design thinking, actually feel that they are capable of engaging beyond what's typically called core design. This is feeding into their beliefs in how they may engage in the design of a company, entrepreneurial venturing, that is. And at the same time, formal educational specializations relating to design versus business had a differential effect on the entrepreneurial tasks that students believed they could perform. Formal design training was positively linked to a student's belief in their ability to engage in new product development, but negatively linked to business opportunity identification and commercialization. So there's a split there. And feeding this results back into the topic of the conference, what we think this might show us is that the two conceptions of design, that is design as a kind of thinking, in this case adaptive cognition, or design as a type of profession, in this case formal educational training, cannot be reduced to one another since they do exert differential effects on entrepreneurial outcomes. So we cannot just say that we have studied design thinking and then we know all about what design, how design impacts something else. In this case, when we look at the impact on entrepreneurial intentions and entrepreneurial self-efficacy beliefs, it actually is important to both consider how the students feel that they are capable of thinking and how they feel they are capable of doing something based on the educational training that they have received. So both have an explanatory effect that operate independently of one another. You cannot reduce them to just one thing. And that is, of course, one take-home message we felt was important for this event. And together, thus, they may help explain why so many designers end up starting their own business. Thank you.
I think we have just